Hi, I'm your classmate Brian Burgess, just south of Dallas, Texas, where I teach history at Ovilla Christian School. Abraham Lincoln said that nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. So based on the wisdom of our 16th president, I cast my vote for the world's greatest leader, to the father of our country, George Washington. Now, George Washington, when he was just 22 years old, was a major in the Virginia militia. And he was sent by Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia out to the Ohio Territory to tell the French to stop building their forts and stirring up the Indians to attack our settlers that were moving west. George Washington and his men actually began the French and Indian War by firing on the French. When George Washington returned to Governor Dinwiddie with his written report, the governor was so impressed by it that he had it published, and George Washington became an overnight media sensation and the most famous man in Virginia. By the end of the French and Indian War, at age 28, George Washington had become the most famous man in all of America. And then, by the time the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, George Washington was the most famous man in the whole world. It's interesting to me that in 2012, there was a poll conducted by the British Military Museum that named George Washington as Britain's greatest ever foe. At the end of the war, you're probably familiar with the fact that George Washington's army and generals wanted him to be the king of America. But George Washington said, we didn't fight this fight and struggle so that we could have a king. We fought it for freedom. And it was George Washington's character and his reputation that made the Constitutional Convention possible in 1787. It was the very aura of his own presence that kept the convention together long enough to give us the U.S. Constitution. He was the only man ever unanimously elected president of the United States, and he was elected twice unanimously. He could have served, been in power for the rest of his life. But George Washington said, no, two terms in office is plenty for any president, and he went back to Mount Vernon. Now, Lucifer in the Bible demonstrates that power corrupts, just as our founding fathers knew. That's why they put the checks and balances in the Constitution. And they knew that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And here's a man who had in his fingertips absolute power twice and laid it down. Now, where did that humility, where did that integrity come? He was the most noble man of his age. He was the most respected man in the whole world, as well as the best known. Where did that come from? Oh, by the way, did I tell you that George Washington was filthy rich with over 52,000 acres? This is his Mount Vernon estate. This is a picture of the ballroom there. If you go to Mount Vernon, as they take you through, they'll show you the ballroom, and they'll tell you that here in this ballroom there were heads of state, kings, duchesses, dukes. There were nobles from around the world. There were governors, senators, representatives from the United States who were here. But no matter who was here, every night at 9 o'clock, the party was over because George Washington retired. No, he didn't retire. He had an appointment with a greater official. This is George Washington's study. And every night at 9 o'clock, according to a nephew of his that lived with them, George Washington would go to this chair, put his Bible on it, put the candle on the corner of the table, and he would kneel and read his Bible out loud, write down his prayers, and pray out loud for an hour. But every morning at 5 o'clock, he got up from bed, went back into his study, put the Bible on the chair, knelt before it, and read out loud and prayed out loud. He wrote many of his prayers in a little prayer journal called My Daily Sacrifice. And everybody is familiar with the very famous paintings of George Washington in Valley Forge, kneeling in prayer. One of the French officials who had not met George Washington come into camp and asked one of the soldiers where he'd find George Washington. It was early in the morning, and the soldier said, he'll be the man kneeling in prayer. George Washington, in this very famous picture, is kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge. This is a story told by Isaac Potts to his good friend and the man who wrote it down, Presbyterian minister Nathaniel Snowden. And Snowden records that Potts was coming through the woods one night on his horse, and he heard a sound. He stopped, got off his horse, and tied it to a tree, and made his way through the woods and found George Washington kneeling in the snow in prayer. Prior to this time, Isaac Potts, who was a Quaker, he was a Tory. He was not for the war, didn't believe the Americans could possibly win against the British who ruled the land and the oceans. But he came upon George Washington praying. And the reason George Washington was praying in the snow, remember, he prayed out loud. And he couldn't find a place in camp where it was private, so he went out into the woods, got off his horse, knelt down in the snow, took off his hat, and prayed to God and asked for wisdom and for victory for America. When Potts got home, his wife said to him, "What happened to you?" He was noticeably moved. And Potts said, "I was going through the snow. I heard General Washington pray. God is going to answer that prayer. America is going to be a free country." And he changed immediately, according to his own testimony, he changed immediately from being a Tory to a supporter of the United States of America. And it's because of George Washington that there is an America. You see, because George Washington was there, America is here. And I pray that God will give us more men like George Washington. And I pray that I'll be one of them.